Değerli katılımcılar, muhterem dostlar, 14 Kasım söyleşisine hoş geldiniz. Çok kıymetli bir konuşmacımız olacak, Omer Bartov. Ve bize Görünenin Ötesi, Gazze, Soykırım ve Tarihsel Bakış başlıklı bir sunum yapacak. Kendisi İsrail doğumlu, Tel Aviv Üniversitesi ve Oxford St. Anthony's College'da eğitim gördü. İlk çalışmaları Nazi ideolojisinin Alman ordusu üzerinde etkisi ve İkinci Dünya Savaşı'nda işlenen suçlara odaklandı. Bu konularda Doğu Cephesi ve Hitler'in Ordusu adlı kitaplarını da bu konuları ele aldı. Daha sonra savaş ve soykırım arasındaki ilişkiyi aramızdaki cinayet, yıkım aynaları 2000 ve Almanya'nın Savaşı ve Holocaust 2003 kitaplarında inceledi. Temsiliyet üzerine ilgisi, sinemada antisemitik imgeleri analiz ettiği Sinemada Yahudi 2005 adlı çalışmasına yansıdı. Sonraki araştırmaları Doğu Avrupa'nın sınır bölgelerindeki etnik ilişkiler ve hafıza politikalarına odaklandı. Erased, Vanishing Traces of Jewish Galicia 2007 ve Anatomy of a Genocide 2018 bu alandaki önemli eserleridir. Son kitabı Tales from the Borderlands 2022, Holocaust öncesi dönemi inceler. Güncel çalışmaları Genocide, The Holocaust and Israel-Palestine 2003 ile yakında yayınlanacak olan Israel, What Went Wrong ve The Broken Promise adlı kitaplarda devam etmektedir. Ayrıca Kelebek ve Balta adlı romanı 2023'te yayınlanmıştır. Avrupa tarihi ve şiddet üzerine ders veren ve soykırım tarihi yazınına katkılarıyla tanınan Profesör Bartov, Görünenin Ötesi, Gazze, Soykırım ve Tarihsel Bakış başlıklı konuşmasında çağdaş çatışmaların tarihsel temsilleriyle olan ilişkisini tartışarak soykırım, hafıza ve ahlaki tanıklık meselelerine odaklanacaktır. Dinleyicilerimize hatırlatmak isterim, simultane tercüme olacak. Bunu lütfen değerlendirin. Now we're going to switch to English. Dear guests, thank you for joining us for today's session, part of our Global Reflection series hosted by Enstitü Sosyalin. Today, we are honored to welcome Professor Omer Bartov, an acclaimed historian and expert on World War II, genocide, and memory studies. A leading voice in Holocaust and genocide studies, Professor Bartov combines rigorous historical scholarship with a keen sensitivity to memory, representation, and the lived experiences of communities affected by the conflict. Today, he will share insights on historical memory, the ethics of representation, and the ongoing relevance of these histories in contemporary debates. Please join me in warmly welcoming Professor Omer Bartov, and I must say that I'm deeply honored to be his moderator. Thank you so much. Professor Bartov, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much for this very kind introduction, and thank you all for listening to this. What I'll try to do in the next 40 minutes or so, leaving some time for discussion, is to try and summarize for you my views of what has occurred since October 7th, 2023, some of the roots of that, how I came to conclude that what we were watching was a genocidal operation, and maybe a few words on where I think this may be heading, and what are the alternative scenarios. So, as some of you may know, in early November 2023, I published an op-ed in the New York Times in which I warned that what Israel had been engaged in since October 7th for about 4 weeks gave clear indications that the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, were engaged in war crimes and in crimes against humanity. By that point, about 10,000 people were killed in Gaza, the majority of them civilians, and large areas were completely obliterated, particularly by the Israeli Air Force, and later on also by artillery and tank fire and bulldozers. And I warned that if this were not to stop, it could be seen as genocide. I tried to show at the time what the indications are and what the difference is between these types of crimes. Um, so on October 7th, as you know, Hamas unleashed a military operation crossing the defense barrier that Israel had built between the Gaza Strip and civilian towns around the Gaza Strip, and murdered about 800 civilians, as well as killing somewhere between 300 and 400 army personnel. Um, that event was followed by statements that were made by Israeli politicians in the immediate aftermath of this attack, already on October 7th, 8th, 9th, which appeared to have a genocidal content. So I would say, first of all, the attack by Hamas as such constituted, in my view, a series of war crimes and crimes against humanity, and that has to be shown, that has to be conceded. And there are those who could link those attacks by Hamas to the original Hamas charter of the late 1980s, and to claim that this was a genocidal attack. I'm somewhat skeptical on that, but an argument can be made. The statements being made by Israeli political leaders and military leaders seem to indicate genocidal intent. They spoke about, most prominently, such statements as by Yoav Gallant, then the Minister of Defense. They will have no water, they will have no food, they will have no power, they are human animals, and they will be treated appropriately. And many statements along these lines that spoke about, as the Israeli president said, there are no uninvolved people, so meaning everybody should be targeted. That Gaza should be flattened. Later on, statements saying that this would be the Gaza Nakba, that is, that there would be indicating ethnic cleansing, intention of ethnic cleansing, and so forth. At the time, there were many people who said, well, these were statements that were made in the heat of the moment because people were outraged by the Hamas attack, and one should not take them as actual indications of planned operations. At the same time, Israeli officials also stated what the so-called official goals of the war in Gaza were. And the official goals were to destroy Hamas and to release the hostages. We have to remember that 251 Israelis were taken hostage and were being kept at the time by Hamas, some of them for hundreds of days. And that appeared relatively reasonable as a war goal. But the extent of the destruction and what appeared to be indiscriminatory attacks seemed to rise very quickly to war crimes. And now, war crimes are, of course, serious breaches of the rules and customs of war, and the most important element here was use of disproportionate force, disproportionate in relationship to your military goal. So if your military goal is, say, to kill 2 or 3 or 5 Hamas militants, and they are hiding in a tunnel under a school, and in that school there are hundreds of displaced people that your own army had told to go there for shelter, and you drop a 2,000-pound bomb on that school because you are hoping that that will kill those militants, and in the process you kill 100 civilians, women and children, that could be construed as a war crime because it's disproportionate use of force. And there was plenty of evidence of that happening in those early weeks of the war. Crimes against humanity, of course, among other things, extermination of civilian population, whether it's in wartime or not. And the extent of the killing of civilians was such that it appeared to be rising also to the level of crimes against humanity. Genocide is a very different type of crime. There is a convention on genocide. That convention is of UN Convention of 1948, came into force in 1951. And that convention defines genocide in a particular way. And while many people may have different definitions of genocide, the one that matters under international law is the one provided by that UN convention. And that definition is that these are actions, genocide are actions carried out with the intent of destroying a particular group, an ethnic or national or racial or religious group, in whole or in part, as such. So what's important in this definition is that it speaks not simply about killing large numbers of people, it speaks about the attempt to destroy a group as a group. That is, you're not killing people as individuals, you're killing them or causing them various types of harm with the goal, with the intent of destroying the group as a group. And among those actions are killing members of the group, causing severe mental and physical damage to members of the group, creating conditions calculated to bring about the destruction of the group in whole or in part, preventing births in the group, and taking away children from the group. Of these 5 types of crimes, subsequently, as I will explain, it appeared to me initially that 3 of those were applicable, and subsequently, in fact, that 4 of them, the first 4, were applicable to the actions of the IDF in Gaza, that is, to Israeli policy in Gaza. Now, as I said, in November, I was still not convinced of that. I was anxious that this was the direction in which Israel was heading. And that's why I issued that warning. And I should say that had the United States acted in November or December of 2023 to stop the Israeli actions in Gaza, we might have said that, yes, crimes were committed, large numbers of civilians, unprecedented numbers of civilians had already been killed, but that it did not quite become genocide yet. But of course, the US and Europe did not step in, and Israel continued its actions. And by May of 2024, I became convinced that there was sufficient evidence to show that the IDF was not, in fact, trying to carry out the official goals of the war, that is, the destruction of Hamas and the release of the hostages. And it has to be said in retrospect, Hamas was not destroyed. It was destroyed as a military organization, but not as the political force in Gaza. It is still now in the areas that are not controlled by the IDF, controlling those parts of Gaza that are not under IDF control, about half of the territory. And the hostages were released only, the vast majority of them, only under ceasefire agreements between Israel and Hamas, and not through military action. So why did I come to that conclusion in May, June of 2024? Because at that point, about half of the population of Gaza was concentrated in the city of Rafah, in the southernmost part of the Gaza Strip on the Egyptian border. And they were there because the IDF had displaced them, claiming that they had to leave their places of habitation for their own safety, because those places would become areas of operations. Those places were then destroyed. The homes that they left were destroyed. And then when the IDF wanted to move into Rafah, the last area that it hadn't taken over, it displaced the population once more, about 1 million people, to Al-Mawasi, to the beach area in the southwestern part of the Gaza Strip, and then proceeded to level Rafah altogether. By August, the city of Rafah, which before the war had a population of about 260,000 people, was completely destroyed. And at that point, looking back at what the logic of operations was, what the pattern of operations was between October and May, June of 2024, it appeared clear that the goal of the operation was to make Gaza uninhabitable for its population, to destroy places of habitation, to destroy public buildings, to destroy the infrastructure, water plants, power plants, agricultural areas, and to destroy everything that makes it possible for a group to sustain itself as a group. Educational institutions such as schools and universities, which were blown up, places of worship, such as mosques, museums, archives that can help to sustain a group's collective memory. All of those were systematically destroyed. My conclusion was then, and that was in the summer of 2024, and I wrote about it in an article in The Guardian in August, that this was clearly a genocidal operation, the goal of which appeared to be the ethnic cleansing of Gaza, that is, removing the population from the place because it was no longer inhabitable. But of course, the people of Gaza had no place to go to. They couldn't cross the border to Egypt. They couldn't cross the border to Israel. These are the only two borders that exist. And therefore, as has happened in most modern genocides since the beginning of the 20th century, ethnic cleansing became genocide. And that is in many cases that I can cite. So from this point on, there were various shifts in what was happening because of changing U.S. policies. In October of 2024, there was growing pressure on Israel, and Israel started a clear ethnic cleansing operation of northern Gaza, north of the Netzarim corridor, the top third of the Gaza Strip. In January, as President Trump was moving into office, he forced Netanyahu to declare a ceasefire. This was against what Israel wanted to do. And there was a ceasefire between January and March of 2025, which was followed by a further intensification of violence, which included also massive deprivation of food and water to the population, which of course is another type of war crime that can also be a genocidal crime if it is under the general heading of an intent to destroy the group as such. And as we know, most recently, a ceasefire was forced upon Israel against what Israeli policy actually wanted to accomplish by the administration with Trump's 20 points, which came into force this October. So this is the sort of, I'd say, the course of things. At the moment, we're facing a situation where the IDF controls about half of the Gaza Strip. It's still engaged in demolition in the Gaza Strip. It should be said that although everybody was speaking about a war in Gaza, actual war operations ended at the latest in June of 2024, and one could argue that much earlier than that, and that since then there has been some guerrilla resistance by disparate Hamas operatives, but by and large, what the Israeli forces were engaged in was systematic demolition operations. To the extent that by now about 90% of houses and schools are being destroyed in Gaza, either destroyed or seriously damaged. So what we are seeing now is that the areas that the IDF does not control are again under control of Hamas. Hamas is destroying whatever gangs have come into force there, supported by Israel. And that while there is a vague plan to replace Hamas as the ruling authority, first by international forces, mostly Arab, potentially Indonesian forces. There were supposed to be Turkish forces, but Israel is adamantly opposed to that. And that those then would hand over control to some kind of Palestinian representation, hypothetically under the Palestinian Authority, which, as you know, is in the West Bank. Whether this will happen or not is up in the air. It's not at all clear that this will happen. The population in Gaza is living under extremely dire conditions. There's been very little rebuilding at this point. Reconstruction has not begun really. Food supply has improved somewhat, but the conditions are still extremely dire, partly also because the entire medical system was deliberately and systematically destroyed by the IDF. So I want to say a few words about the causes of all this and then about where this might be going. The immediate causes, I would say, for the Hamas attack on October 7th, 23, were two. Now, we know that Hamas was planning this operation in advance, and we know now more or less why it unleashed it the time that it did. One was that there was major political unrest in Israel itself, and that had to do with Netanyahu's new coalition, which was put into place in late 2022, that unleashed the so-called judicial overhaul, which was really a judicial coup, in early 2023, with the attempt to greatly weaken the Supreme Court, which was perceived as the only bulwark for the rule of law in Israel and the only institution that might somehow prevent growing violence also in the West Bank and the eventual annexation of the West Bank. Many secular, liberal, Jewish Israeli citizens felt that this judicial overhaul would threaten their own privileges and rights within their society, and demonstrated in vast numbers, hundreds of thousands of people on the streets every weekend. That created a sense of instability in Israel. And Hamas was obviously looking at that and thinking that this might be an opportune moment to unleash its own operation. The second element was that Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the United States were in negotiations over normalizing relationships, but the relationship between Israel, the Gulf states, and Saudi Arabia, opening trade routes to India, and changing in that sense the political map and eventually the economic map of the Middle East. And there was interest in the Gulf states, in Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the United States in doing that. The only problem was what would happen with the Palestinians. And the Palestinian issue had in the previous years increasingly disappeared from the map. It simply was not really spoken about. In Israeli election campaigns, the occupation was not even mentioned. And in fact, the occupation became synonymous with radical left opinions. It was not a term that was officially even used in Israel. And the policy of the Netanyahu government had been for years to say that this issue can't be resolved, it can be managed. And managing the occupation meant that there would be a siege of Gaza, and there would be a growing apartheid regime in the West Bank. This was what managing the occupation meant. And clearly Hamas was afraid that if Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the United States and the Gulf states reached an agreement, the Palestinian issue would disappear forever. And so that something had to be done. That was the immediate cause for the timing of the attack, it appears. And it was good timing in the sense that Israel was completely taken by surprise. It was a huge military fiasco. um, which was perceived as such by the Israeli population that felt abandoned by its own government and by its own military. You know, it takes 90 minutes to drive from Tel Aviv to Kibbutz Be'eri, which is the kibbutz in which over 100 people were murdered. Uh, the IDF took 8 hours to get there. So it just gives you a sense of how incompetent the initial military response by Israel was to this attack, how ill prepared the military was and the political leadership. But there were, of course, much deeper reasons for all this, and they are those that really matter. And the deeper reasons are that Israel has been occupying Palestinian territory since 1967. Now, we, of course, can go back to 1948, and I'm happy to do that, but here I'm focusing on the fact that between 1948 and 1967, following the Nakba, following the expulsion of the vast majority of Palestinians from what became the State of Israel, Israel became a Jewish majority state in which only 20% of the population were Palestinians and 80% were Jews. In 1967, Israel occupied the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Many of the people that were expelled in 1948 were living there. In fact, most of the population of Gaza are refugees and the descendants of refugees, of those who were expelled from mostly from villages and towns that surround the Gaza Strip. And so from 1967 on, Israel becomes, in fact, de facto, a 50-50 state. It's a state in which half of the population are Jews and half of the population are Palestinians. Of them, 2 million by now are Palestinian citizens of Israel who hypothetically have equal rights but de facto do not. And there's a lot of discrimination on a variety of levels against Palestinian citizens of the state. 3 million live in the West Bank, and they have no rights at all. They live under military rule, and that is what created an apartheid system there. That is, that there are now 650,000 Jews who live in East Jerusalem and the West Bank who live under Israeli law. They're extraterritorial Israeli citizens, and they have all the rights and privileges of Israeli Jews, and 3 million Palestinians who have no rights. And so there are two populations that live under two completely different systems of law, which means that it's an apartheid system. And then you have 2 million people who live in the Gaza Strip. And of course, for the 16 years prior to October 7th, 2023, there was an Israeli siege over the Gaza Strip. Israel controlled air traffic, land traffic, and sea traffic into the Gaza Strip, which was ruled by Hamas, but whose external borders were controlled by Israel and a small strip by Egypt. And therefore, that created an increasingly dire economic situation for the people living there. Over time, Israel's occupation became increasingly oppressive, increasingly brutal. It also caused a long-term process of dehumanization of Palestinians in the eyes of most Israeli citizens. That is, most Israeli citizens ceased thinking of Palestinians in particular as people who deserve equal rights, as people who should actually fight for their own freedom, liberation, and equality. And any threat from that population was perceived by many Israelis, and that's not only the extreme right, not only people represented in Netanyahu's current government, but much larger circles than that, as an existential threat. And here, I would say that in a curious and disturbing manner, and I write about this in this book that is going to be published in April in several languages, maybe one day in Turkish too.
Mhm.
I would be very happy if it did.
Yeah.
I talk about one element, which is the extent to which the Holocaust, not the actual Holocaust, not the mass murder of the Jews, the largest genocide of the modern era, but a particular use of the Holocaust uh, became an inherent part of Israeli politics and Israeli self-perception. And that started really, most importantly, in the 1970s and increasingly in the 1980s. That is, that Israeli citizens came to perceive themselves as being threatened existentially by the possibility of another Holocaust. And because Israel simultaneously became the dominant military power in the Middle East and was not threatened, certainly not after 1973, by any major Arab enemy, Arab military force, the only perceived threat to Israeli security were Palestinians. That is a population that was oppressed and ruled by Israel and that had no conceivable way of actually threatening Israeli security was seen as the main threat, as the main existential threat to Israel, and that any resistance by that group, any resistance to oppression and to occupation, was perceived in I'd say, a totally distorted manner as potentially bringing about another Auschwitz. And within this kind of self-understanding that was created and promoted by several Israeli governments and sold quite successfully, also exported quite successfully to Europe and to the United States, that meant that any such threat had to be completely eliminated. And one could see that in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, when much of the rhetoric in Israel was to say that what Hamas had carried out was an attempt at genocide. Hamas was immediately described as Nazis. And on the Israeli media, you could and still can hear often people saying Hamas Nazis as the synonymous. The killing of hundreds of Israeli civilians was described as the largest killing since the Holocaust. So there was an immediate sort of association between that act and the Nazi genocide of the Jews. And that, for much of the Israeli public, and I would say for a long time also for much of the American public and many Europeans, was perceived as license to use disproportionate violence against Gaza as a whole, as a place that had generated that alleged genocide of violence against Israel. Uh, if we try to understand why is it that for 2 years Israel was allowed to carry out this violence against Gaza, violence that it could only carry out with not only with silence, but with direct complicity by such European countries as Germany and the UK, and especially by the United States, which supplied it with vast amounts of arms, economic help, and diplomatic cover. That is veto power in the Security Council. If we try to understand why that is the case, in many ways, it's because Israel had successfully managed to persuade uh, certainly European and American policymakers that it was fighting a genocidal threat and therefore that it was beyond and above any kind of international law. And as I write in this book, what is so tragic in this situation is that uh, in the aftermath of World War II, uh, European powers and the United States um, um, tried, with the creation of the United Nations and with the creation of an entire regime of international law, to prevent the repetition of such crimes as those carried out by the Nazi regime, not least of which was the genocide of the Jews. It was not the only one, but it was certainly one of the, or maybe the most extreme, that was carried out by the Nazi regime. That is what culminated, among other things, in the Genocide Convention, and of course in the Geneva Conventions, in later the Rome Statute. These were all attempts by the international community to prevent the repetition of such crimes. That does not mean that they were indeed prevented, because there were many genocides after 1945, but the goal was to try and create a regime of international law that would prevent and punish such crimes. And the second conclusion, so to speak, of the Holocaust was the support for the creation of the State of Israel. So in 1948, two things happened. One is the Genocide Convention, and the other is the partition resolution of 1947, followed by the creation of the State of Israel on the understanding of the then international community that possibly the genocide of the Jews would not have happened as it did had there been a Jewish state that would have sheltered Jews and protected them at a time when they had no other place to flee to when the Nazis came to kill them. To think that less than 8 decades later, that very same state that was created as a response to genocide would itself engage in a genocidal operation as it did in Gaza appeared to many people as impossible to comprehend, as impossible to accept. And so there was an enormous amount of denial of what was clearly happening on the ground. And now I just want to say a few words on where we may be going from here. The first important thing to say is that the Genocide Convention is officially called the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Prevention obviously did not happen in this case, but punishment must happen. And there is, and one can see that in Europe and in the United States, and of course in Israel, there's now a tendency to say, okay, now it's over. Trump forced Netanyahu's hand, and now let's move on. You cannot move on from genocide. If you identify that that is what happened, there must be punishment. And punishment may be delayed. It often is. Because in order for international law to kick in on the principle of complementarity, you have to show that the state, the individuals in that state, cannot or will not be brought to justice in their own state. It is very unlikely that people like Netanyahu, Yoav Gallant, and others will be brought to justice in Israeli courts. But one has to insist that what Israel carried out in Gaza will eventually bring people to justice. And we know, of course, there are arrest warrants against precisely these two individuals by the ICC, by the International Criminal Court, but that has to be implemented. And I'm still hoping that at some point in the future, we will see Netanyahu in The Hague. So that's just to say that even if this is over, and we don't know, because the violence may resume at any moment, large-scale violence, there's violence there all the time, but much larger-scale violence, even if it does, that does not mean that there should not be accountability. There must be accountability. But as for the future, beyond that, I would say that there are two scenarios, really. One scenario is what is most likely. It's most likely that President Trump will take his eye off the ball because he has many other things on his mind. And he, of course, did not act because he cares much for the fate of Palestinians, that he will be able to rope in Arab states such as Saudi Arabia, the Israeli government and the Palestinian Authority into something that will resemble what Israel created in the West Bank. That is a Palestinian Authority that would really be acting for the Israelis to control Palestinians. Only that in Gaza, of course, the situation will be much more dire because of the terrible destruction that was wrought on it. And that will culminate in a regime of apartheid not only in the West Bank and in Gaza, but also, as is already occurring, increasingly among Palestinian citizens of Israel, whose rights will be even more deeply eroded than they have already, and against Jewish Israeli citizens who are opponents of these policies. The next election in Israel will not be a democratic election, will be more on the model of what we see in Hungary. And that as a result of that, Israel will become a full-blown apartheid state, authoritarian state, kleptocratic state, which it is already, and theocratic state. As such, because religion now is becoming also part of the DNA of that society. And as such, I think he won't have a long lease on life. It is a small country with limited resources. Much of its power is derived from its relationship with Europe and the United States. And it will no longer be able to sell itself as the only democracy in the Middle East. It will lose its power of relying on the Holocaust as a reason to help it because of what it had carried out in Gaza. And even Jewish communities around the world will increasingly, I think, distance themselves from Israel because already now Israel is the main excuse for rising anti-Semitism around the world. And this is happening. Not the kind of allegations of anti-Semitism against protesters, but real anti-Semitism, which is appearing in many European countries and in the United States, and is providing it exactly with the ammunition that it needs. So that's the dire scenario. There is another scenario, and I'm actually engaged in trying to help to think it through. And that is a complete change in the political paradigm. The basis of this is to come to the conclusion, which I think has to be reached. There are now 14 million people living between the Jordan and the sea. Half of them are Jews, half of them are Palestinians, and none of them is going anywhere, or almost none of them. They're all there. And they have to find a way to share that space. They have to stop dreaming of removing the other group. No one is going. And the question is, how can they share that space? And there is now, and all of you can look it up on Google, there is a plan called A Land for All. If you write that on your browser, it'll come up. And it's a confederation plan. And this is something that has been spoken out about now for about 12 years. It's not new. It was initiated by Palestinians from the West Bank in particular, and Israeli Jews, and Palestinian citizens of Israel. And it's an attempt to think about a confederation, which would consist of two sovereign independent states that would agree to be in confederation, whose big difference between that and the defunct two-state solution, which is no longer possible, would be that it would make a distinction between citizenship and residence, so that people could be citizens of one of the states and live in another. You could be a citizen of Palestine and live in Haifa, and you could be a citizen of Israel and live in a settlement, as long as you obey the rules of the country in which you are now a resident. That is, that it would be an entity, a confederation with open internal borders, that people could move from one place to another with common institutions that would regulate the relations between the two states based on the understanding that these two groups can no longer be separated. They live very mixed with each other everywhere. The infrastructure of this whole territory from the Jordan to the sea is totally mixed. And therefore, this has to be politically resolved by allowing all people there to live with equality and dignity in their own state with open borders to the other. I can't say more about it because I want to leave time for discussion. So thank you, and I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Professor Bartov, for your, I would say, wonderful, beautiful speech. Wonderful, beautiful by its content, by also very alarming and worrisome by the perspective that it announces. But anyway, I feel enlightened. So we have some 15 minutes left for questions that will come by. Writing, the participants are invited to write their questions, and I will help to read them and receive your possible responses. While we're waiting for the questions coming, I can, for instance, ask you. How would you explain your approach to contemporary conflicts through a historical lens? You explained the relationship between the memory of the show-off of the Holocaust, and now things have completely changed. But how can we construct this link between the past and the present time?
Yeah, that's a pretty big question. But I'll
I know.
say maybe two things on this. First, on the politics of memory, and second, on what do we learn from other similar or at least analogous events. So on the politics of memory, um, this is something that I've been very interested in for a long time, of course. I mentioned several times that different states drew different conclusions and are still drawing different conclusions from the Holocaust. And to me, this has always been quite interesting. If you think about the way the Holocaust became an important moment in collective memory in Europe, in the United States, and in Israel, you have to say first that it didn't happen right away. In 1945, people spoke about the crimes of the Nazis, but it wasn't really about the genocide of the Jews. It took a long time for politicians, for historians, and for the public, for filmmakers, for cultural activity to recreate the Holocaust as an important event. If you look at history books written in the 1970s, 1960s about World War II, the Holocaust hardly features there, if it's mentioned at all. So it takes a long time. But then when it does happen, it's interpreted in different ways. So in the US, in large part, this sort of general idea was that if you teach the Holocaust, if you commemorate the Holocaust, you teach tolerance from that. You say, well, this tells us that we should not be intolerant toward minorities, that we should not support racism, that we should be open to diversity, to plurality, and so forth. In Germany, the eventual interpretation is sort of the gist of it is what Chancellor Angela Merkel said, that Germany's Staatsräson, the reason of state of Germany, is to protect the state
Raison
of
d'État.
Israel. Yes, the raison d'etat of Germany is to protect Israel. And in Israel, the Holocaust is increasingly interpreted as a license to carry out violence against others because, and it sort of makes sense at a certain point to say, look, when the Jews had no state, had no army, had no police, had no government, they were vulnerable. And that's why they got killed in such numbers. That's why they went, as the saying said, went like sheep to the slaughter. That means that whenever we as Jewish Israeli citizens are threatened, we should grab a gun and kill those who threaten us. We should never again be subjected to any violence, and no one has a right to tell us what to do because look what happened to us in the Holocaust. So these are three very different logics, and each of them leads in a very different direction. The other thing that I would say is what you learn from the past, or the lessons that you can actually draw from the past. When we think of Europe in 1945, Europe after 1945 was one great big pile of ruins. Everything was destroyed. Millions of people were murdered. Millions of people were on the move, right? There were just 12 million Germans who had been expelled, 6 million Jews who had been killed, 3 million Poles had been killed. It was unbelievable, the kind of destruction that Europe had done unto itself. And you think, how did it move from that to where it is today? How is it possible that after all this destruction, and there were many people who said Germany should pay a price, we should destroy Germany, there should never be an independent Germany. This was spoken, but that's not what happened. What happened was the Marshall Plan. And it wasn't for love of Germans, but it was for good political reasons, that to have a Germany in the heart of Europe that would be destroyed would be the best way for the most radical forces to rise again, whether there would be communists or there would be Nazi or fascist or whatever they might be. And so reconstruction, and in many ways kind of forgiveness for the crimes of Nazism, was crucial to making sure that it won't happen again. And I think maybe we can draw some lessons from that if we try to think of a new political paradigm for Israel-Palestine.
Thank you so much. So we have a number of questions. How do I proceed to read them? Because I don't see them on my screen.
I think it's on the chat.
Yes. Second. Well, I have a number of questions. Could you just help me to fly over the, yeah. Let me start with the first question. Professor Bartov, thank you for your comprehensive presentation. I have a question about your proposal for the solution, which is very interesting, but the majority of Israeli society hasn't really protested to the Netanyahu government's genocidal actions, and they fear the Palestinians. So how could they live together?
Yeah, look, I mean, obviously, this is a very, very hard time. It's not only the majority of Israelis who, uh, and unfortunately, I've written about it, that is, there is complete denial in Israel of what Israelis did in Gaza. There's indifference to the fate of Palestinians. That's absolutely true. Um, it's heartbreaking for me to see it, and I think that among Palestinians right now, the idea of any kind of compromise with Israelis, with Jewish Israelis, appears anathema. It's impossible to think about it. Certainly, not as long as there is no coming to terms with what Israel carried out in Gaza. So I agree that at the moment, the public is in a very different place. But I would add to that that even recent opinion polls have shown something very interesting. They've shown that both Jewish Israelis and Palestinians, if you ask them, what do you think will happen in the future, they basically are afraid of each other and they would like to see the other group disappear somehow. But if you provide them with a different scenario, if you say to them, under different circumstances, if there were a leadership that you could support, if there were a plan, a feasible plan for some kind of different existence between and coexistence between the two groups, a realistic plan, not some sort of pie in the sky, most people say they will take it. So the problem is that we right now have no leadership. I have to say, not for Palestinians, not for Israelis, no internal leadership that is pointing in that direction. Uh, and they are fear mongering and producing more and more violence within the populations. And there's no external pressure to change that paradigm, which is why, in my view, the internal dynamics don't exist right now. I absolutely agree. But if there were external pressure, that external pressure can produce those internal dynamics. And if those internal dynamics are uh, made more available, what they need is some kind of plan. They need some sort of blueprint for what then do we do if we don't want this kind of logic of mutual destruction. Where do we go? And that's why I think this confederation plan is one that can be there for the moment at which those forces, and they exist, they just can't flourish right now, for those forces to grab onto and to try to move to a better future. But yes, it has to begin by pressure from the outside, much more in Israel, of course, because it's the superior force there uh, that will generate a different kind of political leadership.
Thank you so much. We are running short of time, so maybe just one last question, or do we have time for? Okay, let's go through two questions. Well, in Gaza, we see that civilians, especially children, are not the intended targets, yet they have become the group most severely affected. Do you think reality has now surpassed the moral and analytical limits of the concept of collateral damage? And what kind of ethical and theoretical transformation does the current international legal regime needs in order to address its structural failure to protect civilians? Well, it's a very broad question, which is basically about my domain, international law, but well, I'm deeply interested to see your reaction.
Look, I'm afraid that I have to say that I'm not at all sure the children were not the intended target. That's part of the problem. That's why I have spoken about what Israel carried out in Gaza as genocide. Uh, what is genocide? Genocide is the attempt to destroy a group in whole or in part as
Yeah.
such. How do you destroy a group? One way of destroying a group is destroying the future of that group. What Israel carried out in Gaza was not only the killing of up to 20,000 children, it also created conditions, another section in the Genocide Convention, that were calculated to bring about a severe mental and physical harm to the population, and particularly to children who were deprived of food, of sufficient food for months on end, of clean water, of medical services, and were constantly exposed to trauma. The effect of that on that future generation is incalculable. Uh, and there were many people in Israel who were talking precisely about that, who were saying those children, when they grow up, they will be Hamasniks. They will, precisely because of what we did to them, because we killed their families. So there is a genocidal logic to it. Now, you can expose it and you can change it. But it is a genocidal logic, and that's part of the kind of mechanism which is both denial and affirmation at the same time. We didn't do it, and they deserved it. That's the kind of they are. This was no genocide, but after what they did to us, we had to do it to them, and now they will do it to us if we don't continue doing it to them. That's the kind of internal logic of it. What does it do to the regime of international law? It's been the the damage has been huge, and one has to say that there are two main conflicts happening right now. One in Ukraine with the illegal Russian invasion of Ukraine, and the second is what happened in Gaza and what is ongoing in Gaza and in the West Bank, and that is destructive of the rule of international law and of the international order that was built after 1945. And while many people may think that it was not such a great international order, they have to think of the alternative. And the alternative, which is why this legal regime was actually built, is that might is right, is that vast, strong, the biggest countries, the great powers agree with each other on the fate of small countries, that they share the goods. That's the alternative. And so we have to stand up and try to protect that international order, because otherwise we are facing a collapse of everything that had ultimately been built after 1945, and we may slide back into the kind of chaos that we saw in the first part of the 20th century.
As an international lawyer, I fully agree with what you're saying, fully. From a technical legal viewpoint, I fully agree. Well, the next question is, how should civilian testimonies from Gaza be interpreted in historical research?
That's a great
Testimonies.
question. That's something that's a very important issue, and I would contextualize it in two ways as well. First of all, and I was greatly involved in that in my own previous writing, testimonies of the Holocaust were often neglected by historians who claim, well, they're subjective, people don't remember well, we need only documents. In the Nuremberg Tribunal, mostly official documents were used. In the early histories of the Holocaust, mostly German documents were used. And that, of course, creates a wholly distorted picture of what happened, because you see the events only through the eyes of those who carry them out, only through the eyes of the perpetrators. You don't see it through the eyes of those who were subjected to the violence. And there's been a change, and I was part of that change. I wrote a whole book, The Anatomy of a Genocide, which is largely based on first-person histories. And I've been a big proponent of using first-person history in writing a more integrated history of such cases as genocide, precisely because the goal of genocide is not only to destroy a group as such. The goal of genocide is to destroy the memory of the group, the fact that it ever existed, and the manner in which it was destroyed. So it erases it entirely. And the way to remake it is through the voices of the people who were subjected to that violence. So that's about the Holocaust. Now, the story of 1948, of the Nakba, has never been told fully. And it hasn't been told fully because there are not enough official state documents that are not the Israeli documents. It was reconstructed by Benny Morris, by an Israeli historian, on the basis of Israeli documentation. And that's a very important thing to do. But the voices of the Palestinians who were subjected to that violence, Elias Khoury wrote about it in his novels, right? In Gate of the Sun, he wrote about it based on first-person testimonies. But there's no official history of that. There's no... And the case of Gaza, in order to tell what happened in Gaza, we need those voices. So I know that they're being collected. I know that they exist. And I'm sure that in the future, there will be a history that would be written of what occurred in Gaza, which will be in the voices of those people who were subjected to precisely what Israel right now is engaged in denying. It's crucial to do that.
Thank you so much. Our another question. Well, this will be the last. Professor, do you think the two-state solution is still valid while Israel continues its unlawful policies in Gaza, the West Bank, and Jerusalem? And do you think it is possible to achieve this solution under Netanyahu and his coalition?
So the answer to the second question is no, absolutely not. No, I mean, with this government, it will never happen. And I'm not sure that even if, God willing, Netanyahu loses the next election and there's another government, I'm not sure that that other government will be the right government either, because the Israeli opposition on these issues is not that different from Netanyahu. So we need a different political leadership, and we don't see it yet. However, as I said before, I think that the old two-state solution is dead. There is no traditional, the traditional idea of the two-state solution. That is, that there will be two states and there'll be minefields and barbed wire between them. There will be what the Israeli Labor Party talked about already in the 1980s. There will be hafrada. There will be separation, which is another word for apartheid. That they will be there and we will be here. This is still what you hear from the Israeli left. Yeah, they can have a state. They'll be over there. We'll be over here. That is not going to happen. There are 650,000 Jews living now in the West Bank. They're not leaving. The entire infrastructure is connected. If any Israeli government tried to remove the settlers from the West Bank, there would be civil war. The settlers are now in the elite of the army, of the secret police, of the internal security forces, of the government. It cannot happen. That's why we need what I talked about. We need a confederation. We need to create two states that would be together and that would recognize that you cannot separate the populations. So you have to change the status of the populations in a way that some of them are citizens of the state in which they live, and some of them, while they're citizens of one of the states, can live in the other. I assume that if this happened, large numbers of the settlers would actually leave and go back to live in what would become the state of Israel, which would be within the 67 borders. Many of them went there not for ideological reasons, but because they were given cheap housing, nice villas. That's why they went there. But there is a more radical element, and those are the people who are doing all the violence right now. And they may stay. But if they stay, they would have to abide by the laws of Palestine. And that would be very difficult for them. If they don't abide by these laws, they would be deported to their own state. So I think the old state solution is dead. The separation is not viable, but a confederation is in fact the only way to bring about a change in the political paradigm, and it can eventually evolve into one state for all its citizens. I think that would be ideal. I don't think that's what most people now want. I think they're too afraid of each other and they want to have their own sovereign state. So could be an interim phase toward creating one state for all its citizens.
Thank you so much. Well, I think we're over. Professor Bartov, thank you so much for your enlightening speech and wonderfully concise, succinct, and understandable. And it's going to be of great help for Turkish public opinion, our young students, our scholars, to understand what's going on and to understand what could happen in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye bye.